And I'll give you like APA-style results section for each, so that you'll get a really good sense, applied sense of like what exactly this looks like. All right. I'm also going to hand this out, actually, because this goes along with that. It gives you all of the tests and some information about like how to actually get to the output in SPSS. Okay. And I did SPSS just because I feel like it's like the most accessible one. It's probably the one that most of you are familiar with. If you like code, R is amazing, and if you like playing with code, you would really like R. R is also amazing because of the fact that there's an online community of people obsessed with R. So you have a question, you just type it in, and the stats geeks, they answer like immediately with like tons of code. It's amazing. So I just like type my questions back, and they just come. They just come on in. So a t-test, very simply, just compares means between two groups. An ANOVA is an extension of a t-test. So you use a t-test if you have two groups. You use an ANOVA if you have more than two groups. The non-parametric alternative, which I'll give you for all of these, is the Wilcoxon sum rank test or the Mann-Whitney test. Just as easy to interpret, honestly. It's just a matter of clicking an extra button. A paired t-test is going to be comparing means between two related groups. So if you are taking data from collecting data from a subject before, having them run on a treadmill or something, and then collecting data from them after that, you're going to need to use a paired samples t-test because it's the same individual, right? Or if you, in our field, what we'll often do is collect data from before about their knowledge or their attitudes toward sex, say, and then we'll put them through an educational session, and then we'll collect data afterwards for their knowledge and attitudes, and that would be a paired samples t-test if you're just looking at two variables. And that's the Wilcoxon sign rank test as well. Some assumptions that are necessary here. So you should always address your assumptions. Any of you who are doing master's theses, you're going to have a whole section in your or dissertations. Maybe no, none of you should be doctoral students. You're going to have a whole bunch of. Are some of you doctoral students? Oh, okay. Oh, a few of you. Okay, great. Welcome. In your dissertations, you will have, and in all of your theses, you will have a whole section dedicated to assumptions. Once you're done with that document, if you go into academia and you continue doing this stuff, you will never have a section of assumptions again in your entire life. People just don't put this in papers. But we do assess for them, and it is important to assess for them because it can really mess up your results, and you could be making some pretty great errors if you don't pay attention to assumption testing. For example, and this happens like I have papers published from early in my career that I'm like, oh, I really messed up the assumption testing on that. Like, I analyzed dyadic data as if they were individuals, which is a huge problem, like not okay. I went to a dyadic data workshop and I was like, oh God, like my paper might come up as like one of the ones that they use as an example here. But I just didn't know any better. I was in my doctoral program. I hadn't done all of the MP. I hadn't done all the biostat stuff. I just didn't know any better. And that's okay, like you learn from that, but do the assumption testing and make sure you pay attention to it, because it does matter. I went back later and analyzed the data the way it was supposed to be analyzed, just because I was curious. It was the same results. So that made me sleep at night. But not that like the 82 people who read that paper would care, but. Okay, so assumptions for t-test, it needs to be a normally distributed outcome. So that outcome variable, you need to make sure it's got the bell curve. There have to be equal variances between the groups. You can kind of tell about equal variances. So you can split the groups and look at the outcomes and make sure that they're relatively the same in spread. If you have different sample sizes in the different groups, then that can become a problem with t-test assumptions. So you want to try and keep as many of the same variables or same number of participants in each group. Also that the groups are independent. So in my case, the couples, not independent, violates this assumption. Don't do a t-test. It wasn't a t-test, by the way, but groups, and then the dependent variable needs to be interval or ratio. So, this isn't really that important, but this is more important. So here's how you do this. In SPSS, does this look familiar for any of you who have played with SPSS? Okay, good. So you go to Analyze. You're just going to compare the means, independent samples t-test. If you had a pre-post, then you would be clicking on paired samples t-test. And that would require you to, so then once you get that, then this is clearly not my data set. Then you put your test variable here, so, and your grouping variable here. Your grouping variable is going to be the one that has the two groups, right? And then you're going to click on define groups, and it's going to let you put those, I think I have this here. Yeah. So this is your continuous outcome variable, cholesterol concentration or something. This is your treatment group, and then you press define groups, and it's going to put a 0, 1 or a 1, 2. You just need to make sure that whatever you put in here matches what your actual data have, right? It could be 8, 9, it doesn't matter. You just need to make sure that you have the same for in your data compared to that. So, well, a way that you can use this then is that say you have a grouping that, say you have a variable that has like multiple categories that you could have chosen from, like let's say geographical location. And say you wanted to choose then a grouping variable and just compare like 2 countries to each other. You could enter that variable in here. It's just only going to give you 2 groups. So say I want to compare Canada to US, but I have data from all over the world. Then I can just use the number that represents Canada for one of these and the number that represents the US for the other one. And you can still analyze just those 2 groups, even if your variable has more than that. Okay? Yeah, so that's what that looks like when you press on define groups. And 1 and 2 or 8 and 9 or 0 and 1, whatever it is. Continue. You can go to the options button and change the, so it's standardized at 95% confidence interval, so at a p-value of 0.05. If you need to change that for some reason, this is where you change that. You shouldn't need to change that on the t-test. Unless you're running multiple tests, and then even if you don't change it, you can still eyeball it with the output. Okay, so you can get through the group statistics, you can see like the means, the standard deviations. You're going to want those things because it's going to tell you that there's a significant difference, not going to tell you what direction that goes in. You have to rely on the means for that. So this isn't quite what it looks like, but and here you can also allow yourself to look if those equal variances are assumed versus not assumed. So do the 2 groups have equal variances? If so, look at equal variances assumed. If they don't, look at equal variances not assumed. And here we're looking at our ability to discern cholesterol concentration based on, what was the other variable again? Does anyone remember? Test condition?
Treatment, I think.
Treatment. Okay, so did they get the treatment or not? Okay, so what is important here for me to look at? Significance. Yeah, so I want to look at two-tailed significance test. And I'm looking at it in equal variances assumed because this also tests this for us. So it's significant at 0.02, so it's less than 0.05. And then what else do I want to look at?
T-value.
So the t-value you'll need to use to report, for sure. And that the way that you would then report this is, oh yeah, sorry. so I explained this already, but it's on the slide for you to look at later if you need it. And so what you would report, this is like what it would look like in an APA output of reporting, is that, okay, I guess this is, the question is, overweight and sexually inactive male participants had statistically significant lower cholesterol levels. It's not necessarily the direction that you would expect. And good thing we use two-tailed. At the end of an exercise training program versus after a calorie-controlled diet. So this is really the important part, though. You want the T, you want the degrees of freedom, you want it equaling whatever the T is, and then you want your p-value. APA has recently changed in that they require you to have p equals, not p is less than. They want the actual p-value. So that's relatively new related to APA. So that's what you would say in the APA results. I must have changed these. Okay, so any questions about t-test? Two groups, right? Two categories. You're looking to see mean differences between two groups, essentially. And you can only get a mean from a continuous variable, right? You can't get a mean from a categorical variable. So two groups, mean difference. All right. If you have more than two groups, say you want to compare Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand, then you would need to use it in ANOVA. Or 3 groups, or 5 groups, or however many groups. That would take you to using it in ANOVA. ANOVA stands for an analysis of variance. It's just an extension of the t-test. It's just comparing means between groups, but it's between multiple groups. And the non-parametric alternative here is the Kruskal-Wallis. The idea here is that you're testing those means for normally distributed variables. So again, they have to be normally distributed. Repeated measures ANOVA can also be used if you have multiple measurements over time and a number of categories to compare within. So you could do 3 pairwise t-tests, right? But your type 1 error would be increased this way. This is why the more complex versions of these tests exist. Because you don't want to just keep on testing the same thing, or you're more likely to have type 1 error. So instead, you look at these differences all at once in one analysis. And you recognize that the variance is what lets you look at more than one difference at a time, right? So assumptions are exactly the same as the t-test. The null hypothesis is that all the population means are equal. The alternative is that not all of them are equal. And you need to check for that normality. You can check using assumptions about the population, so similar things to what we've already talked about. You can look at each group. You can just look at their normal curve, see if they've got that bell curve. You can use a plot for each group. You're going to want to look at each of these groups separately, though, and make sure that they're similar. If you have small data sets, there's not a great way to check for the normality of the data. But if we are relying on physical measurements, which I know a lot of you are, we can typically determine that if we're taking physical measurements from a sample that meets our criteria to participate in the study, so that might mean that part of the criteria is that they're athletes, or maybe part of the criteria is that they're overweight, then they're meeting the criteria for the study, right? So they are representing that variable at least in your sample. So that's one way to deal with it with small sample sets. Okay, so in SPSS, this is found under compare means as well. It's just 2 down from our independent samples t-test, and you're just going to use one way ANOVA. You've got the same things here. Your time is going to go in that dependent list. Your factor is the course, or let's say with our example that we were using, country would be the factor. The factor is that categorical variable. You do need to click on post hoc within here. There's a little button that says post hoc, because in a t-test, you only have 2 groups. So you can just look at the means and know that one of those groups is higher than the other, right? That's where the significant difference lies, is that this one's higher than this one and it is significantly different. But with an ANOVA, you don't know which groups are significantly different from each other. Yeah, you can rank them, but you don't know if Canada is significantly different from New Zealand or if Canada is only significantly different from the USA, for example. So the best one to use is the 2 keys test. That's the most common. The Chiffre test is the non-parametric alternative, I think. Oh no, sorry, the Games-Howell is the non-parametric alternative. So I usually click on both of those because you're not going to find out about equal variances until you have that Levine statistic. And you click continue. Also, it's good to have the descriptive stats, the homogeneity of variance, the Welch. Some of these are just standard, that they just come up. Means plot will not standardly show, so if you want a plot that shows your data, then you need to click on that and decide to, and have that output for you. So the descriptives, they just help us describe the data, right? That homogeneity of variance, this looks to see if those groups we're comparing are similar. We can use the Levine's test to tell us that. You're not reporting any of this stuff though, right? These are just like allowing you, it's guiding you for where to look in the table of your output. So the ANOVA table, it has, you'll know that it's the ANOVA table because it has this. This just shows whether overall is there a statistically significant difference between groups. Doesn't tell us where the difference lies. It just tells us if there's a significant difference. So, and if you had, so there's, we would use a table, if we didn't meet the assumption of homogeneity of variance, there's another table that outputs for that, but we do here, so we're fine. But this is just, and you are going to report this. You will report this F statistic. You see that it's significant, you'll report this F, you'll use degrees of freedom of 2, because you're looking between the 2 groups. That's the test here, that's what we're testing for, is between groups. We're not testing within the groups. So you'll report those things. You won't report the sum of squares, or the mean square, just the F, the degrees of freedom, and the significance value. And then that's